He said people who only finished middle school aren't even worth talking to.
During a company trip, my colleagues ignored me because he had been insulting me as a middle school grad, or the guy who got in through connections. My patience had reached its limit. I wanted to lash out at him right then and there, but I held back. That's because I had a brilliant idea.
I'm heading home then.
After telling my colleague that, I decided to book a return flight immediately. Upon completing the company trip and returning to the office, my colleague was faced with, "My name is Brown, and I'm 40 years old. I'm an office worker. Born as the eldest son in a large family, we weren't rich, but I enjoyed every day. In middle school, I was only good at academics. I thought about going to high school, but I gave it up. Considering our family finances, it was better to start working immediately."
You don't have to worry about us.
No, I decided because it's what I wanted to do, so I'm going to work.
Of course, my parents were against me finishing with just a middle school education. But I insisted and started working after graduation. However, still being inexperienced, I faced a lot of hardships in the real world. Being only a middle school grad meant I was often looked down upon. But, with my natural tenacity, I persevered at my job at the Chinese restaurant where I was hired to help.
Hey, you're working hard again today. Just don't overdo it.
Yes, thank you so much for your concern.
If I was the first one in for prep or took the initiative to clean, gradually, the others' perceptions of me began to change. Even a senior coworker, who had previously ridiculed me for being naive due to my education, started to acknowledge me for the first time. While surprised, I was genuinely happy and responded energetically. Realizing that this is what it means to have your efforts rewarded made me even more dedicated to my job. As I gained more social knowledge and improved my interpersonal skills. By the time I had been working there for 4 years, I began to consider leveling up my skills. Then, a senior coworker suggested I interview at a well-known local company.
There are plenty of recent grads applying, so you should feel comfortable going for it. Good luck. I'm rooting for you.
Thank you so much, I really owe you a lot.
Encouraged by my senior who celebrated my new beginning, I thanked him deeply with a bow. While it was sad to leave the familiar job and the senior I had gotten close to, it was time to take the next step. The interview the next day was nerve-wracking, but a week later, I received an email notification of my hiring. Even with just a middle school education, I felt a sense of achievement that my efforts had paid off.
That's great. You got the job at the company you wished for. Keep up the good work. We're supporting you.
My parents said, delighted as if it were their own achievement. Encouraged by my family, I approached my first day at the new job with a mix of nerves and excitement.
My name is Brown, and I'll be working in this department. I look forward to your guidance.
After the orientation, I was guided to my new department where I introduced myself energetically. The applause and smiles from my new bosses eased my nerves and filled me with joy. I was determined to do my best here. But that feeling was short-lived. After all my colleagues had finished their introductions and were waiting for their supervisors to be introduced, a colleague approached me.
Which university are you from? You didn't mention your university during your introduction.
He asked, curious why I hadn't mentioned a university. His name was White.
I didn't go to college, I only finished middle school.
It was embarrassing to say it myself, but I believed in honesty and gave an honest answer. However, as soon as White heard that, he burst out laughing suddenly.
A middle school grad? Seriously, how did you even get into this company? Who's your connection? Tell me.
A connection, I didn't use any.
Not only was I ridiculed for being a middle school grad, but White also misunderstood that I got hired through someone's connection. I completely denied it, but he couldn't seem to accept it.
If that's not it, there's no way a middle school dropout could get into this company.
Everyone else, including me, graduated from prestigious universities. I'd even graduated from the University of Tokyo.
The University of Tokyo, that's impressive.
Feeling overwhelmed upon hearing about the University of Tokyo, White continued proudly.
That's right, isn't it? Everyone else got into this company based on their skills. I won't lose to you.
Even though there's no competition, for some reason, I was seen as a rival. Shortly after joining the company, friction arose between White and me.
Brown and White, sorry for being late.
I'm Smith, your supervisor. Nice to meet you. If there's anything you don't understand, or if you're in trouble, feel free to ask me anything. Perhaps caught up in his own work, our boss, Mr. Smith, hurried over to us with a smile and greeted us warmly.
I'm White. Nice to meet you.
Contrary to his previous attitude towards me, White responded energetically with a smile that left a good impression. Despite his terrible attitude, I found solace in the fact that our boss, Mr. Smith, made a good impression. So, I decided to greet White with the same energy. Little did I know, this was just the beginning.
Good morning.
The next day, as I arrived at the office, I greeted my other colleagues, but there was no response. I found it strange. But my suspicions were confirmed when White appeared, chatting with the same colleague from before walking away. At that moment, when White glanced at me and smirked, I knew for sure that something was up. He must have spread the rumor about me being a middle school grad to our other colleagues. Is this something unacceptable in this company? Is it because they think I got in through connections? I couldn't help but sigh. Then, someone's hand suddenly rested on my shoulder, startling me reflexively.
Sorry, I didn't mean to startle you, but...
Good morning, Mr. Smith. Sorry, I just got startled, so don't worry about it.
I said as Mr. Smith, resting his hand on my shoulder, approached. However, I couldn't help but feel my face twitch, wondering if he had heard my sigh earlier.
You seem a bit down. Everything all right?
Of course, I'm fine. I'm looking forward to your guidance as always.
Feeling guilty for worrying him, I tried to cover it up with an energetic response. Mr. Smith didn't seem particularly suspicious, and we headed to the office, chatting along the way. However, White's hostility towards me escalated day by day.
Hey, nepotism much. Do your job properly, all right?
Every time we crossed paths at work, he would mockingly call me nepotism guy or middle school grad, making a deliberate effort to ridicule me. Ignoring him only seemed to agitate White further. Moreover, because of what he had spread to other colleagues, I was now being called nepotism guy and middle school grad by them as well. It was tough, but I used it as a motivator to excel at work. Come to think of it, this wasn't the first time. Even when I worked at the Chinese restaurant, I wasn't recognized by those around me and had to work under frustration. Thinking back on that time, I found myself getting fired up at the thought of being bothered by such minor harassment and immersed myself in work. And before I knew it, 3 years had flown by. I became competent in my job and learned to provide customer-oriented service. Thanks to that, I built trust, and now our performance is on the rise.
You're the top performer in sales again this month. Brown, you're doing great. Keep it up.
Yes, thank you, sir.
I replied, feeling proud as the manager praised me. For White, who overheard this praise by chance, it was probably not amusing. Little did I know he was gritting his teeth in frustration. However, his resentment would manifest in the worst possible scenario. It was during the annual company trip, which happened once a year. This year, our company decided to go to Vietnam.
When you think of Vietnam, you think of pho, right? I wonder if it's tasty.
I couldn't help but laugh as I watched Mr. Smith already getting excited about the Vietnam trip. But I was also looking forward to it eagerly. After all, this would be my first ever overseas trip. During my student days, our family struggled financially, so even traveling domestically was out of the question. Now that I'm working, Most of my earnings go towards supporting my family, so thanks to the company trip, I can finally fulfill my dream of traveling abroad. And so, the day of the company trip arrived. Gathering at the airport at the designated time. Everyone had their carry-on bags ready, presented their passports, and boarded the plane bound for Vietnam.
It's going to be fun for the next 2 days, I said to White, who was sitting next to me.
He hadn't been harassing me lately, so I assumed his hostility towards me had diminished, or so I thought. White, however, didn't respond to me, instead gazing out of the window at the scenery beyond. Perhaps he simply didn't hear me. I thought so, until I noticed another colleague sitting behind us purposely addressing White, to which he responded. Feeling a bit miffed by his blatant disregard. I had thought he was starting to acknowledge me by continuing to interact with other colleagues. But it turned out that wasn't the case, which left me feeling a bit disheartened. However, I couldn't control how others felt, so I tried to switch my mindset. Just as I was doing so, he finished his conversation with the other colleague and unexpectedly directed some harsh words at me.
Don't you dare look down on me like you're all that. You got in here through connections.
Ha!
At first, I thought I must have misheard. However, when I looked at White sitting next to me, he was sneering at me. Realizing it wasn't a mishearing, I shot him a sharp glare. What was with this sudden change in attitude? And to say that I simply got in through connections again after not putting me down for a while, it was beyond despicable. Then, to add insult to injury, White continued with some outrageous remarks.
Talking to a middle school grad like you isn't even worth it.
Since our precious Vietnam trip is going to be wasted on you, just book a flight back. Unbelievably, he was telling me to book an immediate flight back once we arrived in Vietnam. It seemed that what he had been discussing with the colleague behind us was about this. As I could hear White and the colleague chuckling together. Usually, I'd channel that frustration into my work, but now we were on a company trip. To hear such nerve-wracking comments during what was supposed to be an enjoyable trip with everyone made me furious.
What's wrong? Can't say anything when you're told the truth.
White's words, delivered in a way that only fueled my anger, shook me with rage. At that moment, something snapped inside me. I had thought that I was relieving the stress of White's harassment by focusing on work. But perhaps without realizing it, I had been accumulating resentment. While pondering this, I found myself uttering those words.
Alright, I'm out, take care, okay.
Huh?
Suppressing the rage that was about to explode, I squarely faced White and said. White couldn't quite grasp my response at first and seemed bewildered for a moment, but soon interpreted it as sour grapes.
I'll make sure to tell Mr. Smith and the boss about it, that you went back home because you felt sick.
Seemingly intent on attributing my return solely to feeling unwell, White continued to cackle in a crude manner. Following his lead, colleagues from the seats behind joined in the mockery. And so, 6 hours after our departure, we all safely arrived at the airport in Vietnam. After retrieving my carry-on bag, I immediately excused myself from the group and booked a flight back.
Can't seen Brown around. White, you know anything?
Noticing my absence, Mr. Smith scanned the area while asking White. But White just smirked as if it were his time to shine.
Brown said he's going back to book an immediate flight back, said he ain't feeling too well.
If he's unwell, why didn't he go to a hospital in Vietnam? And why no report to me? What the heck's going on with him?
Mr. Smith, suspicious of my unusual behavior, expressed disbelief, unable to fathom the situation. Seeing White's dissatisfaction, Mr. Smith felt compelled to report my absence to the manager.
Manager, I heard from White that apparently Brown booked a flight back due to feeling unwell.
Brown, he's usually diligent about reporting to us, so why would he make such a decision?
He could have received treatment at a hospital in Vietnam. The manager also found my actions suspicious and pointed them out. Since Mr. Smith had only heard the story from White, he faltered in his response.
Anyway, Please ask White for more details. I'll try calling Brown.
Understood.
Agreeing with the manager's decision, Mr. Smith followed the instructions and headed straight to White. As the manager bid him farewell, he took out his phone from his pocket and proceeded to contact me. On the other hand, upon my immediate return, I eventually answered the manager's call. After chatting for a while and ending the call with the manager, it was decided that I would return to work the next day. While everyone else enjoyed a company trip in Vietnam, I didn't mind working. In fact, I felt refreshed and ready to tackle the tasks at hand. There were a few other employees who also stayed back at the company instead of joining the company trip to Vietnam. As I eagerly anticipated White's inevitable downfall and patiently awaited his return, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. 3 days passed, and the day finally arrived to finish work in the company trip. Mr. Smith contacted me, confirming everyone's safe return from Vietnam.
Vietnam trip was fun. Back to the grind now.
The following day, White strolled into the office, looking like he had thoroughly enjoyed the company trip. Letting out a big yawn, he seemed rather disheveled. It's amusing considering he insists he's a Tokyo University graduate. Watching from the shadows, I headed to my department before White. As White spotted me and smirked, he predictably approached me.
Feeling better, middle school grad?
Morning, White. Oh, much better, thanks. Seems like you had a blast on the Vietnam trip, huh?
Well, yeah.
He probably didn't expect a smile in response. White seemed taken aback by my smile. Looking at my amused reaction, he seemed to realize something was different.
You're pretending to be unamused? We had a blast on the company trip without you, dude.
Is that so? I was handling business during that time, I retorted, holding back my frustration.
Got yourself into this mess? Or are you planning to blame me?
White's mocking gaze clashed with my sharp glare. Amidst the sparks flying between us, I broke the silence first.
I never said that, but you better be ready for payback.
Payback? What can a middle school grad like you do? He sneered.
Keep looking down on me because I'm a high school grad, you'll soon regret it, just wait and see.
I replied angrily before returning to my work. White, still chuckling, seemed to think my attitude was just a bluff or a sign of defeat. However, a few hours later, my words turned into reality, and White realized.
Hey, seems like you took over my client dealings while I was on the company trip.
You should have received notifications. Why didn't you report it? Getting back at me already. White was complaining to me about taking care of my client matters while I was on the company trip. But I paid him no attention, focusing solely on my work, staring at my computer screen.
Hey, are you even listening? You better not have stolen my clients, you hear?
Frustrated with someone who could only raise their voice in panic, I slammed my fist onto the desk.
Steele, could you please refrain from saying such rude things? Why don't you think about why I ended up handling your clients?
Huh?
Only after I said that did White, with his feeble mind, attempt to think. Yes, even though White knew in advance that he would be away from the company for about 3 days on the company trip. He finally remembered, albeit too late. Sweat started to bead on White's forehead as he realized he had attracted attention by raising his voice.
Right? I forgot. Sorry. Thanks for covering for me. You won?
Saying that with a forced laugh, White patted my shoulder familiarly, but the surrounding gazes were painful. Of course, the gaze directed at him from me was as well.
There were strong requests from your clients to change their representative to me.
How about making a phone call of apology right now if you don't like it? After being told by me, a high school graduate, and likely feeling thoroughly embarrassed, White's face turned bright red this time. Deciding not to say any more, I returned to my work.
If you had time to blame others, you should have done some work instead, huh?
Stop, you're loud enough to be heard.
Chuckled the nearby female employees at White. Realizing he had only brought more embarrassment upon himself, he quickly left the scene to make apology calls to the clients. However, it wasn't just a matter concerning those clients alone. While White was on the company trip, I had also handled his clients without bothering to inform him. White might just complain about not receiving any notification, but ultimately, they were his clients, so he had to deal with them.
I'm truly sorry. You're absolutely right.
Watching from afar as White, burdened with apologies to each client, used a company phone, I couldn't help but smirk. It seemed like a good lesson for him.
It's good I could get back at you during the company trip, Brown,
remarked Smith, addressing me while White was still making apology calls. He was already aware of the tension between me and White. Apparently, he had heard about it from the manager when I rushed back from the company trip. Yes, I had discussed the tension between White and me with the manager when I answered the call from him that time. Upon my return as per White's request, the manager listened sympathetically until the end. The suggestion from the manager was to resume work at the company as usual. Previously, when White took paid leave and missed appointments with clients, the manager had given him a stern warning. Perhaps worried that White might repeat the same mistake not once but twice, the manager requested confirmation from me. As expected, when I investigated, despite White having prior commitments with clients, he took the initiative and contacted his clients, handling them instead.
Thanks to Mr. Smith and the others, I'm really grateful,
White said, aligning his story with mine. I hadn't expected Mr. Smith to support me so strongly just from talking to the manager and Mr. Smith alone. Reflecting, I realized I should have reached out for help instead of shouldering everything myself. In the end, it was my own stubbornness that led to this, and I chastised myself for not being able to go on the company trip. Afterwards, despite White apologizing to each client, they didn't forgive him and demanded a change in representatives. And it was everyone, not just one or two. The one who sprang into action in this situation was, of course, the manager. I was summoned by the manager, and it seems there will be a discussion involving the president as well. Next, I was called to the president's office and moved there with the manager.
Man, this is bad. White got dragged to the president's office over the Brown incident during the company trip.
No way.
During the break, while having a coffee with Mr. Smith, colleagues who had been hanging out with White started making a fuss upon hearing the news about him. Apparently in quite a panic. White had spread the word to other colleagues, oblivious to my presence, so I pretended to cough conspicuously. Finally noticing me, they looked shocked, as if they'd just seen a ghost.
You guys might get called in later too. Better be prepared,
Mr. Smith said with a smirk, and in no time, the faces of my colleagues turned pale. The effect was immediate, and my colleagues dashed out of the break room. Seeing their reaction, Smith and I exchanged glances and burst into laughter.
Did Dad ever have something like that when he was young?
Yeah, I was.
17 years had passed since then. Now at 40, I was recounting the past with White to my middle school daughter. Back then, I was 23 and single, but later found love and got married at 28. Then, we had a daughter. At 40, I was promoted to manager. Mr. Smith became the president, and reminiscing led to White's topic coming up. In the end, after that incident, White was fired by the president, and the colleagues who had colluded with him were also dismissed. While they weren't all fired, some were demoted or transferred to other departments. The president mentioned that White, who was fired, seemed like a shell of his former self throughout the ordeal. White seemed to be working at some convenience store. And President Smith, who witnessed him, mentioned that he had fallen so low that you wouldn't believe he was a former Tokyo University student. Back then, if he hadn't looked down on people based on their academic background, perhaps there could have been a different future. I quietly tucked away the memories of White and stopped retracing them any further.
Well then, I'm off to work today.
Take care on your way. I'm cheering for you.
Dad, do your best.
My wife and daughter saw me off. I waved back in response and headed to work as usual. Things were going smoothly at work. And I couldn't help but think again that it was really a good decision to muster the courage and consult with the manager and President Smith back then.